Hi, everyone. Okay, question one. In what ways have you witnessed conformity in your workplace? Identify times that conformity has been positive and negative. I have witnessed conformity on a few occasions. A negative example is something that I see often, probably on a daily basis. So, since we're in a very small team, my boss expects us all to answer the phones instead of one or two people always answering the calls. But two of my coworkers don't particularly enjoy answering these calls, so they will sometimes let the phone ring. One coworker does this because they notice that the other coworker just allows the phone to ring and doesn't pick it up. I will say though, this is usually in the case when they are busy doing something else, so they don't drop it just to answer the phone call. So the other coworker would conform by also not answering the phone call because they think that it is okay because someone else also doesn't answer the phone. So I would say that this is more of a case of peer influence because a coworker exhibits a certain behavior and another coworker follows suit. And then this distances themselves from responsibility because it was made okay when they saw someone else doing it. A positive example of conformity in my workplace would be where we cannot give absolute answers to student questions just due to the fact that we work with international students and the very complicated nature of immigration policies. So, as we learned, we became better at giving answers without being overly absolute because we cannot really give simple yes or no answers. So, this is something that we picked up from our boss, as she has a very particular way of answering student questions when it comes to immigration. So, we conform due to authority figures. So, in this case, we conform to practices from our leader as we are aware that our boss expects us to answer in a very certain way. I know why she responds in the way that she does, so I don't think that this is something negative, but we have learned to answer the questions by addressing all possibilities and avoiding giving simple yes or no answers. In this way, we gain our boss's approval because we meet her expectations, and thus we are continued to be, we are still allowed to be in roles that allow us to engage with students. Question two. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton. Let's assess this claim via our workplace experiences. Okay, so while I agree with this statement, I have not personally experienced this in my workplace. In fact, I have experienced quite the opposite. The director of our department holds all decision-making power, but she doesn't use that power in a negative manner. She knows how to check her own power, and she does this by asking for our opinions before she takes action on a student's case, for example, just to ensure that she doesn't misuse or abuse her power. I don't actually think that I've had a working experience where absolute power was used in a negative way, such as in the case of corruption. So I would say that I'm very lucky in that regard. And then question three, address the weekly reading. The first article, Underestimating Our Influence Over Others at Work, poses two hypotheses: the overestimation hypothesis and the underestimation hypothesis, sorry. The underestimation hypothesis comes from research regarding being overly confident, illusory control, and false consensus, which all suggest that employees have an inflated view of their influence over coworkers. The underestimation hypothesis stems from research about egocentrism and attribution theory, which suggests that employees will not fully appreciate their influence over their coworkers. The article argues that supportive bosses are associated with higher job satisfaction, lower levels of work-family conflicts, such as work-life balances, lower depression levels, and even lower blood cholesterol. On the other hand, bad bosses are associated with higher levels of dissatisfaction. Something I found interesting was that the article contains that bosses can even influence employees' attitudes and values. I was not surprised by attitudes because they can be formed at any point, but when I think of values, I feel like they're a little bit harder to change. The article provides the examples of crimes of obedience, whereby an employer could perform an illegal or immoral act in response to an order from their superior. Here, the employee distances themselves from taking responsibility because they were simply following orders. When this happens, the employee may have a shift in their values due to their boss's convincing rationalizations. The article also highlighted that fear of embarrassment is a driving force for conformity, both in attitudes and in behavior. Sometimes people underestimate the extent to which fear, embarrassment, or other social pressures may influence another person's decisions. Underestimating one's influence may have implications for organizations, such as managing organizational change and whistleblowing. The article proposed some moderators that may reverse the cause of these biases, such as comparative judgments, the means of influence, and even culture. The article further provides some practical solutions, such as conscious consideration of the perspectives of others. Another practical solution that I found particularly helpful was performance appraisals, whereby the manager examines their own role in causing employees' success and failures to help minimize biases. I feel like these performance appraisals usually happen only to employees, and I feel like sometimes managers feel like they don't need to be doing them, but it definitely is quite helpful and beneficial, especially in the case of having employee feedback on their own superiors. I think that that's also a very useful tool. The second article, Milestones in the Psychological Analysis of Social Influence, focused on social influence and various contributions to the field. The article goes into historical developments, theories of social influence like conformity, and even persuasion and attitude change, like the elaboration likelihood model. The third article, The Dark Triad, How Toxic Employees Get Their Way, was perhaps my favorite article because it dives into psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. The article examines how these personalities in organizational settings and also proposes that employees with high levels of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy often engage in behaviors that allow them to exploit others and gain power, regardless of the negative consequences. The article argues that corporate psychopaths have less levels of corporate responsibility, which can adversely impact productivity. Machiavellianism is associated with diminished organizational, supervisor, and team commitment, while narcissism is associated with unethical behavior within CEOs. The author goes into how these personality types get their way in the workplace. For example, by exploiting situations whereby individuals often manipulate workplace situations to their advantage. An example of this is that they may take credit for others' work, deceive others about their intentions, or undermine colleagues to ensure that they appear superior. While narcissists are known for their charm, Machiavellians and psychopaths can also be highly charismatic. They can use this to gain the trust of others, build alliances, and present themselves in a favorable light to superiors and peers. Organizations must be proactive in preventing the rise of dark triad individuals to positions of power and leadership. And this can be achieved through ethical hiring practices, awareness, training, and promoting a workplace culture that emphasizes collaboration, trust, and mutual respect. French and Raven's 5 Forms of Power was particularly interesting as it outlined different forms of power in the workplace. I think it was helpful to think about how these different forms of power are utilized in a workplace setting. Something that stood out to me was how legitimate power can be unpredictable, and that when somebody loses a specific position, this kind of power is lost, since people were influenced by the position and not really the actual person. And then this makes me think a lot of one of the articles that we read, where sometimes people overestimate their influence over others. So yeah, thank you.